Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the first lecture of the year. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Carl Dobman. I'm the Dean of the College of Architecture and Design. For those of you that I have not met yet, I would ask that you introduce yourself to me if you see me in the hallway or see me in the studio. I haven't had a chance to meet everyone yet, and I'm looking forward to that. So I think it's really fitting tonight that we start the first lecture of the year is to celebrate our alumni. Tonight is the lecture of the Distinguished Architecture Alumni Award. Many of the former members or winners were here. Maybe could I get them to stand up again? Now, and then I was also, well, and Ben, I just saw you roll your eyes at me too, so. And then how about, I know that there's a number of other alumni that are here tonight. Could I get the other alumni that are present tonight to stand? Thank you for joining us tonight. I think this is especially fitting because the College of Architecture and Design is a place that has very close relationships with its alumni. Whether this be through networks, collaborations, alumni hiring, recent graduates, whatever it may be. And then there's also a number of alumni that are also teaching as a way to stay connected to the college and as a way of giving back to the college. So I think it's wonderful to have this tonight as a way to celebrate the alumni. The alumni, or at least the Distinguished Alumni Group, especially is a very welcoming group. I think it was my first week on the job, I was invited to dinner at the Affleck House by the Distinguished Alumni. They're passionate and they're engaged. I didn't see Fred tonight, but Fred cooked dinner that night, and it was a great introduction to the college. The other thing that I'll say just before I introduce Samantha to then introduce Mark is just as a way to connect from the alumni to the Affleck House. I think it's actually Mark, in talking with Mark recently, that Mark was living in the Affleck House, in the Frank Lloyd Wright Affleck House. And I think we actually have Mark to thank for the fact that the Affleck House has been donated, or was donated many years ago, to Lawrence Tech. And so it's, again, those connections from alumni that make this place such an interesting and exciting place to be part of. So thank you for that, Mark. So Samantha Shashulski is she's a 2013 graduate from LTU, and she's the 2016-2017 chair of the college's alumni cabinet. And so Sam is going to introduce Mark tonight.
Thank you, Carl. As Carl just mentioned, I'm this year's chair of the College of Architecture and Design Alumni Cabinet. Our cabinet is made up of 9 alumni volunteers who each serve a 3-year term on the cabinet. And it's our goal as a cabinet to provide initiatives which support the ongoing development and success of our alumni so that they may continue to gain value and support from Lawrence Tech after their graduation. The Distinguished Alumni Award is one of our 2 annual award initiatives that each year that we believe support these goals. It is awarded based on 3 recipient criteria, which include local, national, and international professional accomplishments, support of the College of Architecture and Design, charitable, volunteer, and community service. It is both my own and the Cabinet's honor to recognize Mark as the award recipient this year. I've had the pleasure of knowing Mark for a little over 4 years now. We actually first met when I was a student here at LTU, and he was a juror on one of my critiques for Philip Plowright's class. And I remember one of his critiques on my presentation was that the saturation of color I used in my renderings made it seem like my design was Southern American influence. But really, it was just a really bad Photoshop job. Mark and I crossed paths again when he contacted me when I was an AIAS board member here about making a donation. Mark then reached out with a check to support one student's full registration for an annual conference, and I believe he does that often for AIAS. I had the pleasure of working with Mark also for about 8 months. 8 months of his 20-plus years career at Soroki Architecture. In those short 8 months, I learned a tremendous amount from him. Mark was a big advocate for myself and other aspiring architects' professional development in the workplace. Although our time as co-workers was brief, the mentorship and advocacy and friendship has not been. Anyone who knows Mark knows that the support and mentorship I'm speaking about is widespread among emerging professionals in the field. He often takes individuals under his wings and makes himself available for advice and guidance. Mark holds 3 architecture degrees from Lawrence Tech, including 2 bachelor's and a master's degree in architecture, as well as a master's degree from the University of Cincinnati. He has taught at Mississippi State University, University of Detroit Mercy, and of course here at Lawrence Tech. In 2013, he was awarded the Teaching and Learning Using Technology Award for his online graduate thesis studio here at LTU, which is the very first of its kind in the country, so that's pretty cool. Mark currently serves as the Director of Design at Hamilton Anderson Associates in Detroit and has since 2014, where he's currently working on some of the most notable projects in Detroit, including the new Red Wing Stadium or District Detroit, Orleans Landing neighborhood development, and the Brush Park neighborhood development. It is his design excellence as well as his passion for mentoring young generations of architects that I am confident secured him that position as well as this award. Without further delay, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce you to my colleague, friend, and mentor, this year's Distinguished Alumni Architecture Award, Mark Farlow. And I will also say that it is the 20th recipient of this award as well. So we've been doing this for 20 years.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Very kind. Can you all hear me okay? Yes. Yes, sir. Excellent. Philip told me I would have about 4 or 5 hours to address you all tonight. Thank Philip for that. I thought that maybe this talk would be a little bit more like intellectual if Philip and I were going to do some sort of Cyrano de Bergerac and I would just mouth the words and Philip would actually utter them, and I thought that would be so exciting. It's for me, not so much for Philip. I'm waiting for it, Philip. Go ahead, throw it my way. Philip is the Sean Connery, James Bond of Lawrence Tech. You know, not Pierce Brosnan, but the Sean Connery, right?
Can I ask that we learn about your work?
It's out in the hall, Philip. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Sammy. That was a lovely introduction. Our friendship and our professional affiliation is very meaningful to me. Actually, though, you're obviously not the only person that I do that for. And so tonight's talk, I think, is kind of a love letter, thanks to many people. But before I do that, you know, some people know me for pictures. Sorry, Philip. So we're just going to do this, and I'm going to post this on Instagram, because, you know, the view from here is pretty darn good. Okay, that's fine. So I'll post that later. I will make sure that I get your permission. Is that working?
Can you turn the other one on?
You want to do that?
I'm sorry about that.
Just give you the whole thing.
There you go.
Cheers. Can I use this?
Yes, you can.
Fantastic. My name is Mark Farlow. I am the proud recipient of the 2016 Distinguished Architecture Alumni Award. There are many people to acknowledge right now. Let's start with our new dean, Carl Daubman. On behalf of the College of Architecture and Design, its faculty, its alumni, and the Friends of LTU, welcome to Lawrence Tech. As an alum of the college, I am very excited to see you join our family. You know, Carl invited me to his office last week. It was a warm, friendly conversation with some laughter and some stories, filled really with the promise, I think, of very good things to come. I feel like I was maybe one of the first neighbors to crash the pad. It's a beautiful office. If you haven't been there, please make it a point, everyone, particularly our students, to go visit Carl. If you like books, or if you want to learn more about architecture through publications on architecture, theory, and history, Carl has an amazing library. You know, reflecting on that conversation, it was unavoidable to remember and recall Carl Grimille, the Dean of Architecture here for several of us, particularly for many of the previous recipients of the Distinguished Architecture Alumni Award. Carl Grimille was a warm friend and supporter of his faculty and his students. He was also a formidable presence here from 1974 until 1991. His deep voice still bellows in these halls for me. You know, it's easy for me to think of him today. He took me to Buffalo, New York to visit the Martin House, an exceptional example of prairie school architecture designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. He was probably the reason why I was the Masonry Institute of Michigan Scholarship winner in 1981. And when I think of leaders here at LTU, I often compare them to Carl Grimille. And I guess my parting shot on this thought is that the dean can play an important role in an ordinary student's life. Speaking of important leaders here at LTU, I think we should acknowledge and recognize Dr. Moodgill and Dr. Vaz, the president and the provost of Lawrence Tech. I thank them for their support of the college, their indefatigable time and energy to give back to our college and to the people in it. So I appreciate their role here. And to all of the full-time faculty of the College of Architecture and Design, I'd like to say thank you. The quality of our students is due, in large part, to you. As someone who launched their career here with some phenomenal teachers, the core faculty here are today quite extraordinary. So keep up the good work. And to all the adjunct faculty, many of whom make significant contributions, not only in the lives of our students, but in the professional community of architecture as well. Thank you. As Sammy told you, I am on the roster of the adjunct faculty, and I view that role as a civic practice. To the previous recipients of the Distinguished Alumni Award, thanks for making me a member of this elite group. This would not be possible without the relentless, pit bull persistence of Ben Tizio. Is that fair, Ben? Fair. So thank you for nagging me for 5 years to do this. And I actually look forward to working with you all. I'd also like to thank two former colleagues, Glenn Leroy and Amy Dynas. They served as the dean and the interim dean during the last maybe 11 years. I want to thank them right now for their service and their friendship. While they have moved on, they both served the college in extraordinary ways, and both have been very, very good to me. To the Alumni Cabinet, of which Sammy is the chair, thank you for your support. Thank you for accepting the recommendation from the previous recipients of this award. The Cabinet, in the case that you're not clear, is an energetic group of volunteer leaders who collaborate and make the effort to connect LTU to all of the alumni of the college. The Cabinet works hard, along with our alumni, to strengthen our reputation by communicating our values to others. The Cabinet works hard, along with our alumni, to basically make the best people that are representatives of our university. And in fact, I believe that the alumni are the best recruits because they are the best proof that Lawrence Tech launches successful careers. The alumni are, to our current students here tonight, role models and inspiration. So I would say then that an institution's greatness actually comes from its people. To all of the students here who I am pretty confident are being strong-armed to be here tonight, thank you for being an inspiration to all of us. We see your work occasionally as guest critics. We see maybe your work in reviews, and perhaps in my particular case, we see your work as your faculty. And in my own case, for instance, you all are the reason why we teach. That we are here, you know, in the classroom, you know, I think there's this misnomer, right, that we have something to give you, that you're kind of incomplete as a student. And I feel like that's actually not the case, that we are not here to get in the way of any other process. Rather, we are here to give you what you need to succeed. And actually, every semester, I learn something from each of you. And I think this is why, in my own case, I find teaching so exciting. To the alumni that I've worked with, thank you for being here. The bond between professional colleagues can be very strong. Their support and their presence here tonight is very much appreciated. You know, this is probably something that Julie could validate, but I believe that every architecture firm in the state of Michigan has an LTU alum. Finally, a warm welcome to my family and friends. Thank you for being here. Particularly my family, my mother and father are here, my brother and my sister is here, my wife is here. Tracy, thank you for being here. I love you all very much. So I thought you'd like to meet them. You know, over 40 years ago, I sat in this auditorium, a first-year architecture student, here at LTU. Back then, you know, we called it LIT. And essentially, I was petrified. I was mortified. And I'm obviously haven't, like, gotten over that. But you know, I think about the past a lot. The 1970s were a very interesting time, I think. It was a time of nostalgia. It was a time of individualism. The author, Tom Wolfe, wrote a very interesting book right before he wrote a book on architecture. And that book was called The Me Decade. Yet, you know, the 1970s were a time of change and of possibility. And architecture then, I think, as I look back on it today, it reflected kind of a sensitivity to life on our planet. So I thought I'd, you know, tee up for you what architects, right, in the late 1960s and the 1970s were actually drawing and doing. And so I love this image, you know, of Walking City by Archigram in the UK, Super Studio, the Continuous City from Italy, and then House Rucker, Flyhead, and Yellowheart. I love the idea that architects are creating portable environments, micro-environments, and environments of some isolation. And for many people, the work of these architects exemplified those themes practicing out and playing out in Europe. In the United States, though, architecture reflected a debate between the idea of, and remember, this is like 1970, 1975, the idea of continuing modernist architecture as an extension of what had always been, and to what role history or place and meaning could actually play in architecture. And so for most of us, the sort of chest-thumping, modernist, masculine architecture of the 1960s, the 1970s, looked rather like this. This, of course, is Boston City Hall. And that debate played out in periodicals and in practice. The work of two architects, though, two American architects, by the way, Michael Graves and Peter Eisenman, was fairly well documented in the 1970s, and I think it, in a way, forecasted the generation to come, the next 10 years. And all of this attention to these two American architects may have started in 1972 with a book called Five Architects. It was one of my very first purchases as an architecture student, and I suspect some of you are Googling it right now and finding it on Amazon at a fairly robust price of, I don't know, $250. Carl, am I close? You're checking it right now? I told you Carl has an amazing library. I read this book very carefully, perusing the drawings and lingering on all the pictures and all of these abstract white cubist solid void compositions. I loved them. I also reread Five Architects several times because the essays were very, very dense. Actually, it was a maddening thing for a young architecture student to even comprehend back then. The writing was foreign to me. It was incomprehensible, really. But this book indicated, I thought, a possible shift of where architecture might be going, and that was kind of intriguing to me. Now, these two architects were not the most prolific architects in the 1970s. That distinction would go to Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Alvar Aalto, and Louis Kahn. The mature work of these four architects would influence architects well into the coming decade. Now, we should remember, of course, that Mies and Le Corbusier passed away in 1969. Louis Kahn died in 1974, and Aalto died in 1976. The legacy of their work, though, and the way that our faculty in architecture school regarded them was pretty much the environment that we as architecture students felt and breathed in. And I think that the work of these legacy modernists was arguably the best stuff being built and designed by these architects in the very winter of their career. So in 1978, with a brand new Fiat car, this was like the first iteration of the Fiat when they were really crappy, I was inspired by their work, and I drove to New England all by myself to visit every building I could that was designed by each of these architects. I created, in a way, my own school field trip. I saw the work of those modernist masters, and I was awed. I also visited several pieces by Marcel Breuer, Roche Dinkeloo, Paul Rudolph, and Philip Johnson. And you know what's interesting is all of those firms have buildings right here in Detroit. Seeing architecture in person can be deeply moving. So even today, whenever I talk to students in reviews, or whenever I talk to my team at Hamilton Anderson, or whenever I talk to students in my own studio, I encourage our students to travel, telling them that wherever they go, whether it's Sydney, Ohio, or Istanbul, Turkey, they're in the presence of architecture, and it's just there for you to see and to take in. And I came to learn in school and through these processes of traveling that these are things that you can only know by experiencing them, by being there. If you wanted insight into what architecture was about back in the 1970s, the work of Graves and Eisenman, on the other hand, was pretty pervasive. Every architecture magazine article seemed to be about them, and every design award seemed to go to them. It was exciting at first, the people that you were hearing about in studios and the people that you were seeing drawings and models of in their own work was the nascent sort of way that we took them in, but then their work was validated by awards from the magazines like Progressive Architecture and AIA Journal, the magazines of that time. And at the end of it all, though, I think by the end of the decade, the fact that they won all of these awards became somewhat predictable. But they also lectured everywhere, and I saw them both lecture here. In 1976, I sat in this auditorium. I sat right up there listening to Peter Eisenman lecture about his work. He spoke about the houses he had designed, and this room was absolutely packed. House 6 was the house, the one piece that he talked about that was kind of intriguing to me. I was really fascinated by this house, and he talked about it as if it was an experiment. He would say to our group, he said, what is a facade? And why should the facade be on the outside? He also elaborated that, he said it was a design that was based on the inversion of Gestalt principles. Now, I was like a first-year student, and I thought, what in the world is he talking about? And that kind of stun was really, really significant. And it caused me to think about his work a lot over the coming years. We had the chance, as you remember, to visit the home a few years ago, and that was a pretty interesting thing. It's up in Cornwall, Connecticut, and I think it's actually a lot smaller than I had imagined, and I was I think it was a very beguiling experience at the end of it all. And to see it in person and to meet the homeowners, Richard and Suzanne Frank, kind of humanized the house, which of course Eisenman didn't really want to do when he was talking about it here in 1976. That night in 76, he talked about House 10. He numbered his houses with Roman numerals, in a way detaching the romance and the sentimentality of a homeowner and their budget to the object that he was really focused on designing. What was interesting about House 10, it had its own book, right? And in that book, we learned that this house was intended to be built for the Aronoff family here in Bloomfield Hills up on Squirrel Road. That never happened. The Aronoffs fired him. But I thought that it was worth buying that book, and I looked at that book. I get a bigger migraine reading it and looking at the drawings there than perhaps 5 architects. And here's why. It was a house that was based on an inaccessible void, a room that you couldn't go into. And I thought, this is ridiculous. This is crazy. But, I was under the influence, right? I had sipped the Kool-Aid. Because it was exciting stuff to think about on top of all the other stuff that we were learning in school here and that we would eventually be responsible for, when we finished. But then I was a graduate student at Cincinnati, and I was in a seminar, and Eisenman was there for a week. Scott, this was like 5 years before he got the big commission, and I think he was there to foam the runway for that job. But in any event, he was our instructor for a week, and he was still kind of formidable to me, and in a way, he reminded me a little of Carl Grimille. So I boldly took my copy of House 10, and I walked it into the seminar, and I asked him to autograph it. I was essentially praying at the fountain. And anyway, he signed the book in a very deliberate 3-minute act of showmanship. Then, while attending a lecture by Michael Graves here in Detroit, I introduced myself and mentioned some mutual friends from Cincinnati, which is his alma mater as well as mine. And he obliged our meeting with some sketches in my monograph. And when I approached him, it was very interesting. Nobody was talking to him. It was as if nobody even knew he was there or that they even recognized him. But I taken all 5 monographs in my messenger bag, and I had a big crease in my shoulder, and I kept producing the monographs one after the other. And he just stood there with this brush-like magic marker and drew 5 minutes of drawing. And it was really quite wonderful. And by the time he had finished drawing all of these autographs, he had drawn a large crowd. He had signed my book by sketching a folly of whatever it was, and he was clearly, lost, right, in the process of drawing. He goes, what should I draw next? He asked me, and I'm like, I have no idea. But Eisenman, on the other hand, deliberately opened the book to a blank page and took out 2 fountain pens, one red and one black, and then signed everything in black. I'll go back to it because it's really ridiculous. Signed everything in black, leaving the space where the red N is, and then put the black cap back on the black pen, took the red cap off the red pen, and signed it, and then dropped the N in. It took like 3.5, 4 minutes. I thought, the price we pay for praying at the fountain. But I think those 2 events and how they signed those books, in a way, says a lot about who they are. And it says a lot about how they think about architecture. I think it really succinctly describes who they are as individuals. But I also think that what's important about both of them is that they practiced and they taught. So did many of the emerging voices of architecture back then, including Robert Stern, Aldo Rossi, John Haydock, and Tom Main. And the idea of teachers practicing and practitioners teaching became, honestly, a very big influence on me. My first LTU professors were Harold Linton and Thomas Hans. Victor, do you remember them? Of course. Thomas was an architect who had his own office and taught as an adjunct. Harold was a full-time professor and an artist whose paintings were influenced by the color theories of Joseph Albers, and they were quite beautiful. As my faculty, they taught me the value of seeing art and of seeing architecture. They took us on field trips, and they talked about what we were looking at. They both taught their students to see by experiencing things. Harold, in his quiet whisper of a voice, yet brimming with passionate energy, described the paintings of Saul LeWitt at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Harold had the ability to transfix his audience with stories of the painters, their lives, and their history, and their own work. Later, I would meet Robert Benson, and I would have that same experience. And like Robert Benson, Professor Linton would help his students see a painting not simply as a series of marks on a canvas, but as part of a larger conversation about art and its place and its role in our own lives. It was really stunning to be in his studio. Thomas Hans, an architect, would lecture, drawing on the blackboard, trying to, describe the Fibonacci series, chalk in his hand, chalk all over the place, but drawing on something we call the blackboard. Today, when we draw, it's on a whiteboard. I love the symmetry of that, but the idea of engaging students with something in your hand and writing it out and explaining it that way, I think is a very, very effective way. Thomas would also walk us through all the local buildings designed by the Saarinen, both father and son, and of course by Yamasaki. He would point to a detail or talk about space and wave his arms, and all of those gestures would, in a way, fill the entire atrium. One day, he brought in a phonograph. I don't know if that's going to translate. He brought in a record player, plugged it in, and he put on a record, and it was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. He brought it right into our design studio, and our design studios were underneath in your realm, Carl. Those were our office. Your office was our studio, quite honestly, which is why I was all freaked out about visiting you last week. And he played the Fifth Symphony on that phonograph in our studio, encouraging us to see the structure of this magnificent musical composition. Once, when I was teaching at Mississippi State, we played the music of Mozart and Brian Eno in my own architecture studio. My hope, I guess, was to connect with my students the way my LTU professors had connected with me. I mentioned Robert Benson a moment ago. He was a prominent influence on my own education. He was engaging, knowledgeable, dashing, stylish. We were all required to take his history classes, so meeting him was really inevitable. But I loved that material. I loved his classes. I loved his lectures. Later, I had enrolled as like a junior and senior, I enrolled in his seminars on architectural philosophy, architectural criticism, 20th century architecture, on and on and on. I have all these notebooks filled with notes from his classes. My first experience with Robert Benson, however, was as a sophomore. As a second-year student, I had not met the prerequisites for this seminar, and the dean, as I recall, was not going to budge in order to admit me into the class. I went to Carl's office, which was right through this door at the time, and I pleaded my case to Carl, but to no avail. Unimpressed with his answer, I probably whined a little bit. And so the dean, in what must have been a moment of administrative weakness, said, why don't you just call the president and ask him if he'll admit you? So I did. I called President Marburger at his home. He answered the phone. I knew it was him. He has an unmistakable voice. And watching the dean's jaw drop that day was priceless. It was then that I realized that the reason for the university, the reason for teaching, was because of students. That we're all here for you. Attending Robert's seminar that day, and that semester in 1977, changed my life. It's the story, really, of a student, of Lawrence Tech, of Affleck House, and it's actually one of my favorite stories. What happened is this: a second-year student in architecture from Lawrence Tech, working on a term paper for his elective class, met the owners of Affleck House one day. Then he brought his class and his professor to see the house on a Saturday morning. He eventually completed his term paper. He has no recollection of what it was about or what he wrote. And then he would later become friends with the owner. With the owners, actually, Mary and with Gregor. Later that summer, the owners asked him to move in and serve as the home's caretaker. And they would pay him $3 a day, and he would live there for a year. And that student was me. Later that summer, I suggested to Mary and to Gregor that they maybe consider gifting the house to Lawrence Tech, and by January of 1978, the property's title was transferred to Lawrence Tech, and the rest is history. It really just goes to show you that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And I think it also goes to show you that the schoolwork that you do as a student can have an impact in the community in which you live, that students can actually be that impact. My mom's here tonight, and this is her favorite property, so I'm just gonna let her take these in. We really have the alumni, distinguished architecture alumni recipients to thank, and particularly Ben Tizio and Frederick Butters for marshaling so much money and hard work to improve this property to the state that it's in. We also have Gary Casada, a friend of Lawrence Tech, for these beautiful pictures. I do hope our faculty takes our students there. It's an enchanting place. That was my bedroom. As you can see, the Affleck House really is a beautiful place. And being the 20th recipient of the Distinguished Architecture Alumni Award means that now I have the chance to work more closely with a larger group of distinguished alums who are really responsible for this property's care. Oh, God. So this is a wonderful picture of my siblings and dorky me celebrating Thanksgiving at Affleck back in 1977. I just want you to realize that this may be the only picture of me wearing a turtleneck. Another influence on me came in my senior year. Catherine Beebe was invited to teach a special urban design studio here at Lawrence Tech. I enrolled in your studio because the project was to focus on Detroit, and we were going to have Edmund Bacon as our professor. He was going to fly in every 2 weeks in our 10-week semester. Now, Edmund Bacon, as you may recall, was the former planner in the city of Philadelphia. He was also the author of our textbook called Design of Cities. And interestingly enough, in the late 1950s, Edmund Bacon was also the planner here in Flint. So having him come into our studio every 2 weeks was really pretty nifty. And the idea that faculty can come in as adjuncts and bring friends along with them to our studio began to, and they could be from anywhere really, began to play a big role in my own architecture studios. The studio that we had with Professors Beebe and Bacon was also important to me because it looked closely at Detroit. And this was really the first time we, as architecture students, had a chance to look at a site in the city. My fascination with Detroit probably began visiting Santa Claus at the J.L. Hudson building or taking the bus to see the Detroit Public Library as a middle school student. Or maybe it had to do with visiting the Michigan Consolidated Gas building with Thomas Hans, a brilliant building designed by Yamasaki. Or maybe it had to do with visiting John Portman's new experiment transforming a Piranesi drawing into the Renaissance Center. Or maybe visiting the Guardian building, Hart Plaza, Greektown, Soup Kitchen, right? Any of these places saw me as an architecture student visiting them, sketching them, and photographing them. Detroit became very special. And it came to play a huge role in my career when I joined Hamilton Anderson. We'll get to that in a moment. The studio with Beebe and Bacon was a first in another way. It was a group project. We would work in teams, like we do in offices. And the experience taught the value of leadership. It taught the skills of collaboration, experiences that we would later appreciate once we graduated. One more thing, the late Edmund Bacon is also the father of actor Kevin Bacon. So in a way, LTU and Kevin Bacon are separated by only 1 degree. And I hope it's not an architecture degree. All of these faculty played a big role in my life. All of my LTU faculty did. Bacon, Beebe, Hans, Linton, Benson, actually many more, including Professors Joe Sabin, Patrick Corcoran, Russell Dixon, Bob Champlin, Will Allen, and my thesis professor, George Zonars. I could go on. It's easy, really, it's really easy to look back at these times with fondness. But you know, actually for me, LTU wasn't that easy. And in case you forget, right, architecture is actually really hard. And I was an ordinary student, living at home, and paying my own way through college. Yet LTU gave me an extraordinary set of opportunities, and so despite those obstacles, I cherished all of them. LTU gave me confidence and poise. It's failing me right now, but it gave me confidence and poise, and it gave me an excellent education, and all of those friendships have lasted for a lifetime, by the way. So, inspired by my professors at Lawrence Tech, the decision, and I don't know what I was thinking at this time, the decision to stay in school seemed a good idea. So I enrolled in the University of Cincinnati and pursued a master's degree in architecture. And I studied with the likes of John Meunier, William Whittleson, Jonathan Rees, and my thesis mentor, John Hancock. And working with them and teaching at Cincinnati, which was a really brilliant idea, cemented my passion because I loved learning and I loved teaching. I also met some pretty exceptional students there because I had my first architecture studios to teach at UC. Many of my students would mature in their own careers and become very significant leaders in the community. In 2008, the UC students that had me as their first-year professor held their 20th class reunion, and they invited the late Professor David Nyland and yours truly to be their special guests, and we got to speak to the group. That night over dinner, many of the students came up to me later and said how much our time together in first year meant to them. Teaching can be very humbling. And I loved teaching so much as a young person that I had this harebrained idea that I would pursue a career in academia. So at 27, I accepted an offer to teach at Mississippi State University's School of Architecture. And I really loved the students there, the projects we worked on together, and Southern culture in general. It was an ideal place to learn to teach. When we weren't traveling with our students to Europe, we taught. And we weren't teaching, we traveled. And when we traveled, we sketched, and then we lectured about those magical places and the buildings in those places. And with colleagues like Sam Mockbee, Michael Fazio, Gary Schaefer, James Barker, and Chris Risher, it was really a dream job. And naturally, many of my former students from Mississippi State have made important career moves in their own right, and they often serve in my own studio reviews. But the best part of teaching at Mississippi State was teaching with Martin Schwartz. Sorry, Marty. Marty, as I call him, Marty and I became close friends. Carpetbaggers, really, teaching together, traveling together, even serving together on a faculty exchange between Mississippi State and Plymouth Polytechnic University in the UK. It's no coincidence that Martin moved to Michigan after I left Mississippi. 6 years ago, Marty called me one summer afternoon to run an idea past me. He and Ralph Nelson had been putting the finishing touches on the online graduate program here at LTU, and they needed a faculty member to teach one of the online studio sections. And I was like, what? And he was like, yeah, I'm not really sure how to explain it to you either, but we're here to support you. And so not sure really what we were getting into together, I jumped in and launched what Glenn Leroy says is the country's first online architecture graduate studio. 3 years later, Ralph Nelson and Martin Schwartz nominated me for the Teaching and Learning Using Technology Award, and the president and the provost presented that award to me in a lovely ceremony with a big, huge, sweet sheet cake. That day, the provost said that I was the very first adjunct faculty member here at the university to earn that recognition. I've been teaching at LTU since 1995. Initially, I taught a comprehensive design studio, and then I taught occasionally like history and theory seminars. Dozens of professors since the 1990s have invited me to serve on literally dozens of juries here at LTU, down the road at UDM, and at the University of Michigan. It was in one of these reviews that Martin had that I met Peter Osler, and we hit it off famously. Then Peter had me in his own reviews, in his own studio when he was teaching at Michigan. And then he had the brilliant idea to bring in his wife, also an architect, Betsy Williams. And then Betsy called me in for reviews to join her in her studios. So Carl, I'm really putting the press on right now. Betsy is an amazing presence in the studio. And I really drew so much from her and the way she teaches. And I made who she was and how she treated students and how she got the most out of them from Betsy. She kind of ratcheted up my game. Now, naturally, a year and a half ago, I had the good sense to bring Betsy into my undergraduate studio here at Lawrence Tech. And she lectured about some work that she was doing that had just been published in Architectural Record. I'm sorry, that was about 2005, but then last summer when Peter and I were exchanging emails, because that's how, we communicate today, he and I were talking, and I said, dude, what the heck is Betsy doing now? And is she available to join us at Hamilton Anderson, I asked. And today, she's actually one of our senior architects working on projects that I'm going to show you in a moment. And she is an amazing team member at Hamilton Anderson. And I'd like to say that architecture is so much about connection and coincidence. As I said, I teach in our graduate program. I've worked with over 160 students in the last 6 or so years, 7 years, most of whom I've been interfaced with in an online format, which means that I don't, see them. I see them in their rooms, in their dorm, or in their apartment. But I've actually met all but 10 of them in person. We have in our studios pinup reviews. We're matchmakers, right? We bring 2 faculty members together. We have juries. We even take field trips. Samantha, there you are. I currently teach the Advanced Design Studio here at Lawrence Tech, our core graduate level architecture design studio. Initially, my studio projects were located in cities where my students lived. Basically, the students taught us all about their own hometown. They elaborated on how their cities could evolve and improve by the application of their own design ideas. It's an exciting studio to teach, really, especially in the online format, because I met students from all over the world. I've worked with students from Toronto, Columbus, Chicago, Traverse City, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Shreveport, Portland, Anchorage, even Hong Kong. The Hong Kong student would wake up in the morning with me, and I'd say goodnight to him in the same day. Several of my students have taken their work forward to engage their local community leaders. One student even submitted his own project from our studio to a housing competition, and he won first prize. He was even interviewed on CBC Radio 2. Another student took his project to local civic leaders in order to guide the direction of new development in his hometown here in Belleville. Teaching is the counterpoint to practice, and practice informs studio, and studio informs my practice. Speaking of practice, you must know that I am exceedingly proud. 2000. In my time at Victor Soroki & Associates, I learned important design skills, business skills, technical skills, construction skills. It was a place to design a wide variety of work, from architecture to interiors, from hospitality to high-end residential. I developed deep friendships with the team members there, many of whom I can see here tonight. Sadly, some, like Randy Secondino, also an LTU alum, are no longer with us. Others, like me, have moved on, but we all hold a very special place in our heart for the work there, the team that put that beautiful work together, and for Victor, who is also here tonight. Thank you, Victor. There you are. Thank you, Victor. Then 2.5 years ago, something extraordinary happened. Kent Anderson and Rainey Hamilton called to invite me to meet their team, explaining that their desire to focus more on the city of Detroit with new leadership intact that might be able to grow a high-functioning team of creatives could be met if I joined them. Does that sound about right, Rainey? Okay. After weighing those opportunities, I made a careful decision to move to Hamilton Anderson, an important marquee firm committed to improving Detroit one building, one block, and one neighborhood at a time. Many of the projects in our office are delicate improvements to existing buildings, carefully transforming them to be relevant and appropriate for today's marketplace. Other projects are pretty hefty. Samantha talked a little bit about them. For instance, we're the architects for Orleans Landing on the riverfront, which is under construction. We just completed the renovation of the Strathmore Hotel on Alexandrine in Midtown. We're also working with HOK on the Little Caesars Arena, and we're the design architects for 2 significant buildings framing that arena, both on Henry and also on Woodward. This month, we release our construction document sets for 3 separate buildings in the Corktown neighborhood next to Old Tiger Stadium. Whether large or small, the work in our 70-person firm is impressive, and it's important because it's contributing to Detroit's resurgence, and I'm delighted to serve as their design director. All told, Hamilton Anderson employs 14 alums from Lawrence Tech, and I was instrumental, if not directly involved in the bringing in and the hiring of 8 of these excellent design professionals, and another one starts Monday. Could I ask the handful of people from Hamilton Anderson that are here tonight to please stand and be recognized? Rainey, Don, alums too, Lori. Let's give them a round. Thank you. Last year, Hamilton Anderson entered an international design competition, Missing Middle Housing, and we snagged a 2nd place award from AIA Michigan. I became very intrigued with the approach our team took to this important question of fair housing in Detroit, and how to bring a fresh, innovative approach to this vexing problem. So much so that I completely recast my Lawrence Tech studios, and now we look at missing middle housing in Detroit. But first we'll snack. So my current online studio, last year and this year, looks at housing and the properties in North End, just north of Detroit, in the city of Detroit, but just north of downtown. And then in my, I want to show you some of that work, actually. So I want to give you the character, the flavor, if you will, of North End, and some of the work by our students. Then in my first year at Hamilton Anderson, we were invited to partner with Bedrock and submit a request for a proposal, what we in our industry call an RFP. And that proposal would look at 2 large parcels totaling about 9 acres of basically vacant land that had 4 heritage properties on it. All were in a fairly dilapidated state. And this land was owned by the city of Detroit, and they were anticipating offloading it for the best value. And in that proposal, we looked at both of those large parcels in historic Rush Park and introduced a dense scenario of 5 different housing types, including the historic properties, and inserted them into the 9 acres. And in the spring of 2015, the Bedrock proposal was selected, and our solution for the master plan, the landscape architecture, and the architectural design was met enthusiastically by Detroit's new planner, Maurice Cox. He called the plan flawless, and he wasn't the only one. 3 months later in June, the Congress of New Urbanism, the CNU, as Mark Nikita knows, was holding its annual conference here in Detroit. And they awarded their top prize to Hamilton Anderson for the Brush Park design in the CNU's Charter Awards. Since then, we've been working very closely with Bedrock to bring the buildings that we're responsible for into construction documents, 2 apartment buildings and a residential townhome hybrid building, and those drawings are to be completed this fall. I'd like to invite you all to walk down to the gallery, the top row of renderings in the brick hall, if you will. The brick gallery are relative to the Brush Park Bedrock parcels, but we'll look at some of them on the larger screen here. All of these renderings were done by Hamilton Anderson, but all of the architecture is by a whole bunch of other firms: Merge Studio, Loha, Studio Dwell, and Christian Hertien Architects. want to mention Brian Hertini, Brian Hertien. Brian is an alum of Hamilton Anderson, and he's also an alum of Lawrence Tech. And we were close friends in undergraduate school, and I really, relish the idea that we get to work together. That's my wife, Tracy. This year at Hamilton Anderson, we're working with a New York City developer who actually comes from Detroit. And working with him, we've created another infill mixed-use housing development, actually just south of the Bedrock development. It's on separate sites, separated by brush, and these are some of the drawings that we've created for a recent Historic District Commission submittal, and many, but not all of the drawings are in the hallway. We kind of ran out of room. So I'll just go through them very quickly, and you can look at some of the graphical and architectural work that we are capable of. It's a series of townhomes, carriage houses, alleys, apartment buildings, and a big apartment building. The history of Brush Park is best told by historians and probably not by me. Suffice it to say that Brush Park is Detroit's most important historic neighborhood, situated, as you know, just north of the stadiums and of the home of many, and it was the home of many of Detroit's most luxurious urban mansions. Today, Brush Park looks a shadow of its former self. Often, it's a parking lot for sporting events, but the Brush Park we know today will be changing into an extraordinary neighborhood of contemporary architecture in an appropriately dense and walkable neighborhood adjacent to the newly minted M1 rail. In 2017, Brush Park will be an authentic, transit-oriented development. Hamilton Anderson's role and commitment to Brush Park is almost legendary, and this is why we are so excited to be part of the team executing the vision for its future. This is also why I wanted to share these two projects with you tonight. Maybe the best stories end in thanks. My story started tonight that way, and I think I should end it this way. I'd like to thank Hamilton Anderson, the Hamilton Anderson team for these exciting opportunities. The timing to join you in April of 2014 coincided with an explosion of development activity, and the HAA team seems front and center to almost all of it. I have learned from you that we need to do something every day to remind our city why we're here. Thank you, Rainey. Finally, it's a privilege to give back to the institution that formed us, that trained us. It was a bold move to select me to serve on the faculty at the University of Cincinnati, at the Mississippi State University, at the University of Detroit Mercy, at Plymouth Polytechnic, and then here at my alma mater. But I'm really glad that each school made me as their choice. It was probably a bold move to select me to be the Distinguished Architecture Alumni Award winner this year, but I'm grateful for that choice. I'm pleased that these teaching opportunities and all my career opportunities came my way because I embraced each one with deep appreciation and a lot of hard work. Accepting the 2016 Distinguished Architecture Alumni Award is not just an event, it's not just a lecture, it's really a commitment to begin more new work. I'm sorry to tell you that, Tracy, but that's the case. Tonight, you've given me the most special moment of my academic and professional career, and it's a really long career. The LTU Distinguished Architecture Alumni Award is a pinnacle award for which I am endlessly proud to be this year's recipient. With this LTU award and the expectations it represents, I pledge to be an even better alum. As a faculty member here, I will continue to be a tireless apostle of hope for our students, a hope that we can be better, that we can work harder, and that there is true potential in each of us. Perhaps the best returns may not be in financial gains, but in the investment in human capital. I am a believer in the next generation of architects, and I'll continue to work with them to make our profession even better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. The thought of you calling the president and the thought of you showing up at the house of the Afflecks. Once we let you in, you don't leave, right? Mark's work is hanging in the gallery. I'd invite everyone to go see that. We also have a sign-up sheet for continuing education as we leave, and I'd just like to give Mark another round of applause. This was so inspiring.